We're approaching the Ides of March, so normally you'll see a lot of content about Julius Caesar and what happened to him. And actually, I've done a video about the Pugio, the dagger that was used in the assassination of him. But what I wanted to do was talk about something slightly different. Because when we consider what happened to Julius Caesar, often it's set in the context of shock. This was an absolutely outrageous act. Who'd have thought this kind of thing could have happened? But in fact, leading up to the events that ended with Julius Caesar, there were a number of instances of what we might consider political violence in Rome. Here are a few of them. I'm going to start with the beginning of Rome nonetheless, with Romulus and Remus, which after all was a political falling out and between two brothers, and it fared very badly for Remus. But I should add a couple things here. First of all, there are variations of this myth. Secondly, there's quite a lot of symbolism which might be worth commenting on. Let's consider then what Remus did exactly, because depending on the account you're reading, he either jumped over the foundation wall that Romulus was digging, or he just laughed at it. And you might think it's a bit of an overreaction for Romulus to then do what he did. However, it must be understood that walls in ancient Rome had a sacred aspect to them, particularly the walls of Rome. These had a sort of sacred space either side of them. They weren't simply a thing, they were considered really, really important. And there's also a symbolism going on here, because it has been argued that early in Rome's development you had different factions living on the different hills, because why wouldn't you? And ultimately at some point those on the Aventine decided to attack those on the Palatine and were ultimately defeated, or the other way around. In either case, what this symbolises is that there might have been a lot of political fervour early in Rome's development, that is to say rival factions taking on others, symbolised through Romulus and Remus. And Romulus himself doesn't exactly end things nicely. Depending on which option you agree on, he either ended his days by being taken up to the heavens in a big storm, or being hacked to pieces by senators and then his body spread around. And then one of the senators saying, "Oh, by the way," in order to quell a somewhat angry crowd, "I met the ghost of Romulus a minute ago, and he said to me, everything's fine, we didn't do anything wrong, us senators acted completely fine, just trust us senators, it'll all be okay." Yeah, I know which one I think happened. And in fact, this seems to have set a trend, because even though the regal period in ancient Rome, where they had kings, is largely mythical, the stories they have around what goes on reads a bit like a Tarantino film at points. It's pretty much violence all the way through, apart from Numa. I think Numa's pretty much the only one who seems to have avoided anything particularly nasty happening to him. And again, you can think of the regal period in Rome ending with a very famous myth involving Lucretia, which I won't go into, but again, you've got horrible violence there as well. Moving out of the mythical and into the reality of it all, you have a couple of instances at the end of the 2nd century BC and the beginning of the 1st century BC. So we'll start with perhaps the Gracchi brothers, either of which took a political position and paid for it with their lives. And then you get into Gaius, Marius and Sulla. These two were at each other's throats quite literally. When one came in charge, it got very, very, very bad if you were on the other side, if that makes sense. So when Marius takes Rome, it doesn't end well for anyone who's supporting Sulla. And when Sulla takes Rome, it does not do well for anyone who was supporting Marius, apart from one individual actually, who potentially should have been done away with. But Sulla said, he kind of reminds me a bit of me, so I'll let him go. And that individual was Julius Caesar. And finally, Milo and Clodius. So these were two Roman politicians who really did not get on with each other, and they escalated things through the use of gladiators, which became their sort of heavies, their armed retinue. And in 57 BC, we have an instance where Cicero, who'd been exiled, is being discussed in the Senate, and they're thinking about recalling him. Clodius hates Cicero, doesn't want that to happen. He floods the forum with his gladiators and armed retinue and asks them just to cause absolute havoc, so those inside the Senate house can hear what's going on, and it might disrupt it all. Milo thinks, yeah, in for a penny, in for a pound, sends his men in to the forum, and they start scrapping, and there's a full-on riot, and apparently the streets run red. So whilst the assassination of Julius Caesar was a unique event with huge consequences, it wasn't something unusual in the context of an event where a politician or politicians are involved in violence and either aggravating it or on the receiving end of it.